Luca was not a very tall man, but rather short in comparison to his brother Dragic, who was said to be 6'5", and Juro, who was over 6 feet in height. Luca's citizen papers has his height as 5'6". His Luca's brother Luban was not a very tall man either. He probably was just a little bit taller than Luca, perhaps 5'8". Luca was rather very thin, and he had dark, wavy hair, and his complexion was fair. Although he was about to reach 21, he had no facial hair to give him an older look. Had Luca been sent back home in Bremen, he would have had to go into the army, as most men, when they reached 21, they had to go into the Austro-Hungary army at that time. Luca said he left Bremen about the 22nd of April. His ticket put him in steerage, as most peasants going to America could not afford anything else. While at sea, Luca never said he was seasick, but he told of others being ill. One day Luca left the steerage area, and he wanted to explore the upper deck of the ship. One of the officers, seeing him on top, told him, "You have too many women interested in you, and their men don't like that. You have to go below before you get yourself in trouble." This man was no doubt being polite to a peasant, but ironically, Luca thought the women actually were after him. Other than this incident, Luca talked little about being aboard the ship for 13 days. The ship that carried Luca to America was brought him to Ellis Island, New York. Luca said he and the passengers were taken to the Great Hall. It was a rather frightening experience for all the hopeful immigrants. Luca waited for his turn to be examined by those in authority. He said he saw several people being rejected and women in tears. He thought, "I came so far from my birthplace, and if I have to go back, what will it cost me? How will I survive?" When it came to his turn, he was asked his name and where he was from, and his destination. His destination was to a relative named Malich in Wilmerding, PA. His slip from the passage ship showed that he had $8 when he arrived. He was given a quick physical exam, and the doctor, when he said he was okay, slapped Luca's back, and he said he flew practically across the great hallway. He told his children he had never seen bathroom toilets until his trip to America. When asked what was his reaction when he saw the bathroom facilities, he began to laugh and said, "I thought the toilets were cooking pots," and he couldn't believe people were using them to relieve themselves. Officials at Ellis gave him a lunch bag, which had a sandwich and a banana. Luca got another shock while in America. For the first time in his life, he saw a black man, and he thought it must be the devil himself. The train ride was seemingly long. The conductor left Luca off at Pitcairn. Perhaps some of the railroad workers would help him get to Wilmerding. Luca had no idea where Wilmerding was located. He said he talked to one man, and the man told him he couldn't take him to Wilmerding until he finished his workday. Luca sat and waited, not knowing Wilmerding was only a short distance walking. Luca never mentioned the man's name who was his guide, but he took him to Wilmerding, and the address Luca gave him. It was May 6th, and the home he came to was Theodor Uzelats, and they were celebrating Sveti Juraj. Luca walked into the house, and someone recognized him and said, "Hey, evo naše pjevača." hey, here's our singer. The Zealot's home was a welcome center for many who came to the area. Luca hadn't eaten for many hours, and while they asked him to sing, he told them he hadn't eaten and would be more than happy to join them in song singing once he ate. The hosts were gracious and served him, and of course singing no doubt reverberated to the rooftops thereafter. Luca always considered May 6th to be a special day in his life, and he called May 6th his birthday in America and Sveti Juraj his second Krishna Slava. It would certainly seem he was correct in saying May 6th was indeed a kind of new birthday for him. To leave one's homeland to travel many miles and cross an ocean is no doubt an easy thing to do. It's not an easy thing to do, yet compelling circumstances forced Luca and people like himself to leave loved ones, not only to better their own lives, but they hoped to be able to improve the living of those whom they left behind, especially parents. Unfortunately, Luca's parents were all gone, but he had his brothers over there. Luca had no money and he needed to find work quickly. Someone told him there was work up in Yukon in a mine, so he decided to go there. He did get a job and was careful with the wages given him. The exact days he worked is not known to his family. He didn't stay long there, however, because he became a bit frightened and concerned for his safety and well-being when he heard there was some men preying on the immigrants and robbing them. Ironically, Luca knew them to be of his ethnic origin. Luca had on his person a money belt. His family still has it in their possession. One day, two men saw Luca and said to him in his native tongue, "Hey, Luca, we'll be checking your waist." With those words firm in his mind, he had no wish to stay, and he thought to himself, "I worked hard for these meager wages, and I'm not about to let anybody take it away." And he took his belongings and came back to the Walwomerdine area. The first St. Nicholas Serbian Orthodox Church was about to be consecrated in 1905, and a dear friend of Luca's named George Drakulic, in later years at one of the church meetings, discussing plans for the consecration for the building of another church, made mention of the fact that when the first church in Womerdine was built, that Luka Drakulic pledged 1/2 of the pay he had received for the new Serbian Orthodox Church. He made this point to stress how important the old pioneers were to the community. Upon hearing Juja mention this fact, Luca's daughter, who happened to be at the meeting, felt so touched upon hearing Juja say this about Luca. Helen wondered if Luca was yet working at Yukon at the time of the church consecration, as he didn't start to work on the railroad until 1905. Somewhere shortly after he came to the area, Luca came upon the man who married his beloved Sophie. The man asked Luca how things were back at the Maliches. Luca said he was regretful all his life for the answer he gave him, because Mr. Malich was a good person, but probably Luca loved his daughter Sophie, and Malich wouldn't let her marry Luca, and no doubt this fact still grieved Luca. So when Sophie's husband asked Luca if Malich replaced Luca, Luca told him yes, they hired a nice young man from the cello. Of course, Malich told him to tell his son-in-law they hired a girl from the village. As it turned out, the son-in-law left America and went back home, and thus ended the extra income to the Malich household. One day, Malich came to America for some purpose, and he looked for Luca. When he found Luca, he was quite bitter as he began to speak to him. He demanded that Luca pay what he owed. Luca said he couldn't pay the full amount of his debt, but managed to give him most of it. The exact amount of his debt is not known to his family, as Luca often would refer to money not in terms of dollars, but what was referred to as forenti back in the homeland. Luca, I believe, looked back at that moment with sorrow and regret for his behavior. But as Luca himself said, the devil always looks for a moment of weakness in us and then goes to work. The railroad yards in Pitcairn were hiring men, and Luca began to make inquiries as to how to go about getting work. One man of Slovak descent told Luca, "You have to go and see Andy Morris. He's the one who can get you a job." Apparently Andy Morris had been getting some payoffs from the immigrants for being hired, and Luca was not about to give away his money if he didn't have to. So when he inquired about working on the railroad, he asked one Slovak man how could he talk when he had no knowledge of the English language. The man told him, "When the interviewer says anything to you, just reply yes." Well, Luca listened to what the man told him and kept saying yes. At the end of the interview, he told Luca, "You have no sense, John." And of course Luca said yes, but he hired Luca anyway. However, Luca told of one individual who was looking for work, and a prankster who thought it would be rather funny told the immigrant when he went into the hiring office to say, "Mr. Boss, you son o' bitch, give me job." Hearing him, the man got an interpreter and asked him to point out the man who told him to come inside. The man was brought inside and immediately was told, "You are fired." After Luca was hired, some of those men who paid Andy Morris asked Luca if he went to see Andy, and Luca told them, no, he went on his own. They were shocked, and Andy, no doubt, was knocked down a notch in importance. Luca's life in the homeland gave him strength and perseverance, and as his family looked back at his past and hardships he endured, it seemed to them that the good Lord cared for their father. For had he stayed in his homeland, he would have been drafted to fight in World War I, known as the Great War, where history records record Serbia lost 1/3 of its adult male population. Also, World War II came, and the atrocities that were done to the Serbs, Jews, and Gypsies will never be forgotten by their survivors. And Luca fortunately escaped that tragic time. A Croatian couple whose last name was Ferenc had a house on Grand Street in Wall. They took in boarders, and Luca boarded with them. Luca said the beds in the house were never cold, as there were 3 shifts. The men that worked each shift had bed space. He told his family that a house now occupied by Eleanor Blazevich, wife of the late Joseph Bob Blazevich, son of the late Pana and Yuba Blazevich, once boarded 20 men. The town of Wall boarded the railroad yards, and the Pitcairn railroad yards once upon a time employed 15,000 employees. Luca saved his money and was not as some of the men who wasted their hard-earned money playing cards and boozing. He saved to bring his brother Juro to America. Juro came in 1907, and he too was went to live with the Ferences. Juro got a job on the railroad also. Living in boarding house had its stories. Luca said with so many men coming and going, the board keeper had to be organized and have some kind of system which he or she could depend upon for accountability. Mrs. Ferenc kept beer and alcohol in the house. She sold chips to those who wanted to be served beer or whiskey. Anyone then with a chip could purchase a beer or shot of whiskey. With a house full of boarders, Mrs. Feddens would often ask one of the men to chop some wood or do some errand for her. She would in return give the boarder a free beer or two, and the men never turned down that opportunity to save a chip or two. Luca said his brother Judo was good for chopping for firewood for Mrs. Feddens, but Luca would in later life tease his brother and tell him, "You sure you were just chopping firewood?" Of course, Judo would get a little red under the collar and use some choice Serbian words to his brother. Judo and Luca loved and cared for each other to their very last day of life. They would sometimes have differing opinions, but they never stopped talking to one another. As further on in this story, we will realize how close they were. Holidays in a boarding house were joyous times for all living in the boarding house. It was not unusual for those of the Orthodox faith to celebrate the Western Christmas and New Year with fellow Roman Catholic friends and neighbors. Weddings were never one-day affairs, as we knew them to be today. It was the Western Christmas one year at the Ferences that Luca put his work in limbo because he and the others were devoting themselves to singing and enjoying one another's company and visiting the home of friends nearby. Lucky for Luca that he happened to be at the Ferenc home one day. Someone in the house spotted a man approaching the house, and they told Luca. Luca said he jumped into bed and covered himself with blankets and began to act like he had a bad cold and coughed quite strenuously. It was not unusual for the railroad to send out someone to check on an employee if he did not show up for work for a couple of days. And that time, Luca was the one that the railroad was concerned about. The man was let inside, and he told them he was looking for Luca. He was led to Luca's room. Luca believed he was the railroad doctor. He called out to Luca and asked, "How are you, Luki?" Of course, between his fake coughing, he told him, "Not too good." As Luca told this story to his children, he was laughing because had the doctor gotten close to him, the smell of his breath would have knocked him over. But the doctor simply said, "You take care of that cold, Luke, and don't come back to work until you feel you are better." Probably the doctor knew what was going on with Luca and the others, but he went along with them. Also, perhaps such a visit could encourage the men to come back to work sooner than they wanted to. And this, of course, turned out to be true in many instances. All the Ferences were a good and kind couple to their boarders. One would probably have to have some pity on them because with a handful of boarders and all the things they had to contend with, even Luca said they had no privacy, and their life wasn't really one that anybody would really envy. Luca said the couple would leave the house together and go to the outhouse in the back to discuss privately what they didn't want the boarders to hear. Of course, Luca laughed at his words as if to say there were other motives. Mrs. Ferenc hired a young Croatian girl by the name of Jana Tushkan, who had just come to America to help with chores in the house. Jana cast her eyes upon Luca and never lost sight of him. She fell in love with him. Luca, as any man, felt flattered with the knowledge she was smitten with him. Luca was still dreaming and planning to save money, enough money to go back to the homeland and reclaim his lost love, Sophie. His conversation about Sophie made one believe his love for her was eternal. As much as he longed to see and be with Sophie, Luca, deep inside, probably knew he lost his chance with the incident he had with Sophie's husband and her father. Her father placed much trust and faith in Luca, and even if the opportunity availed itself to Luca, so far as Sophie was concerned, Luca believed knowledge would not be forgiving for making his son-in-law come home. As much as Luca loved Sophie, so Jana loved and longed to be with Luca as his wife. One day, Jana informed Luca that she was pregnant. Luca at first did not want to believe her, but then he knew that he was as much fault as she in carrying his child. As the servant, Yana worked very hard at the boarding house. In those days, the floors had no carpeting, and the men were crude, as they were back in their homes abroad. Spitting on the floor was a natural thing for them, and Yana had to scrub the floors. All this could have effect on one's health, as perhaps it did on Yana, as the story continues further on. When Luca found out she was pregnant, he told her he was going to find another place for them to live, and he didn't want her to do any more of the chores she was doing at the boarding house. Luca found a house on Wall Avenue that the people of Wall refer to as being Mosside. Yana gave birth to a daughter. They named her Yuba. Not much is known about the child's health, but she did not live long, and Luca didn't talk much about the child. Luca didn't give any comment as to being displeased in becoming a father. His conversation about Yana seemed always caring. He told about the times he came home drunk. He would lie down on his bed and be in what was almost a coma-like sleep from the booze in him. He said when he opened his eyes and was sobering up, he found Yana crying beside him. He was startled to see her crying and asked, "What is wrong?" She replied, "I was scared because I thought you had so much whiskey in you that it was going to burn out your insides and you would die." He chided her for being so foolish in her thinking, but as he told this to us, no doubt he was somewhat proud to know that this woman cared so very much for him. Yana had a brother named John Tushkan, who was also a friend to Luca and Juro. He often came by, not only to see his sister, but also spend some time with Juro, who was single. One day the two of them were down in Braddock, and Luca said they probably were drinking while there. They were at the railway station waiting to get the train to come home. Juro fell asleep waiting for the arrival of the train when he heard someone say, "The train is here." Not quite awake, he jumped up and walked into the train, which hit him. He was injured badly, and they took him to the hospital. As a result of injury, Juro was left a cripple. His hip was injured and his leg. Juro, when he recovered, found his foot was shorter than the other, and for the rest of his life he had to wear one shoe elevated. Also, he had to use a cane. When Yana's brother came to the house and told Luca what happened at the railroad station, Yana cried. She told Luca she had wished it had been John and not Juro. Luca never explained to his family why she said this about her brother. Perhaps it may be that she was not too close with her brother, or perhaps she knew that Juro and Luca were very close to each other, and seeing Luca feeling so depressed at the news of his brother's accident broke her spirit too. Life as it was once for Juro changed, and having been left a cripple for life, his social life probably was altered. Juro was tall and handsome from a photo that he had taken on the beach in Atlantic City. He went on a vacation with his boss, Mr. Obermeyer. It was said this boss helped Juro to learn how to speak and read in the English language. Each of the brothers were different from the other in their personalities. What Luca told about Dragic really was not much in the way of what we know about Juro and Yuban. Perhaps this is because Dragic was the eldest, living so far away after their immigration to America. Contact was limited, since Luca, Juro, and Yuban were illiterate, and perhaps Dragic was also. However, we learned that Dragic at some point in his life did get married and had a daughter. The girl, Luca thought she died when she was about 6 years old. Dragic was a soldier in the Balkan War. Apparently, he was never put in jail for the Drakulic hay-cutting incident involving Simo Drakulic. He died of what Juro said was dysentery in 1915. He sent before a few years a picture of himself in his soldier's uniform. It is the only picture we have of him, and we are fortunate for this, and are grateful that he sent the pictures to his brothers. When Dragic's widow decided to marry after someone proposed to her, she wrote to Luca and Giuro telling them she wanted to know if they had any objections to her marrying this man. Luca said there was no reason for them to object and wrote and told her that she was free to marry whoever she wanted. Dragic's wife, we believe, was in some way connected to Marco Tarbuc, our neighbor. We don't know for sure yet if that was his sister or a cousin or something, but we feel sure that our father told us that Dragic's wife was related to Marco. So far as Dragic and his wife in life, that was the last bit of information we were given about the two of them. This, I guess, concludes the story of Drakulic, one of the four brothers. Somewhere in the last few years, another person enters. Somewhere in the last few years of their lives, someone enters into the Drakulic family, whose life will fill much space in this history, and that, of course, is Stana Drakulic, who was born and raised also in Selo Okic. Stana was the daughter of Janko and Kata Drakulic. Janko's name, recall, was mentioned earlier in this history when Petra's house caught on fire. Janko's nickname was Koshut. Kata's mother was a Drakulic, but her mother was a Mrđenović. Kata Drakulic was from a Drakulic family, but she was not related to Luca's side of the family, Luca's Drakulic side of the family. It seems the area where Luca lived had many families named Drakulic. Kata had a deformed leg, and she never walked upright as a normal person did. She bent over and with her hand always held it to her knee, and with this deformity, she had 11 children. Out of the 11, Stana, her two sisters Stanka and Stanica, were the only survivors out of 11 births. It seems that Kata longed to have a son. One of the ladies in the selo told her when and if she had a girl, again, to rhyme that daughter's name with the last she had, and she would have a male child. Stanka was the first daughter born after the woman told Kata about the rhyming of names. She had Stana and then Stanica next. Ironically, Kata's next pregnancy, there was twins born. One of the twins, male twins, one of the male twins died early, and the second lived to be about 6, Stana said. Not much information was told of any other births. Stana was the eldest daughter, and it is customary for the eldest daughter to marry before the younger. Stanka was in love with a Croatian man, and neither the Croatian man's family as well as Stanka's family would be consenting to such a marriage. Yet Stanka was past the age that most girls are married when they marry. So when Janko Selak's time came to marry, they thought there was a possibility that somebody from Janko and Kata's family would be a good arrangement. So there was an agreement among both families for a marriage with one of the girls. Stana was more suited in age, but Stanka was the eldest, and the eldest was supposed to leave the home before the younger. So when Janko Selak came to the house, Stanka was the one who was offered an apple with the ring inside. Stanka accepted, but her heart was with the Croatian man. Stanka and Janko Selak married, and Stanka went to live with Janko at the Selak home in Tušilović. It is not known if Janko Drakulic was still alive when Stanka married. However, Stana told her family that her father had just returned home from a day at the market and had a bag of onions which he had put down on the floor in their home, and suddenly he collapsed to the floor. From this it is assumed that Janko Drakulic died from a heart attack. Kata lived until 1925. Stana believed her mother was 85 years old when she died, so she probably was born around 1840. Ironically, this is the extent of knowing our ancestors. What people or events took place beyond Janko and Kata Drakulic's lives, as well as Petra and Svio's, is all lost to us. No one from my mother Stana nor my father Luka has some recollection of anybody's past, except for their own parents. There were some moments in Stana's life back in the old country she would talk about and laugh. Stana had a cousin named Vaja Drakulic who married Micha Blažević. She said the two of them would often sing together. Stana said people named Stankoviches were living in their area and they would hear them singing. And their singing would bring tears to their eyes as they listened to them. This, of course, was noticeable to Stana's children, for many times she would be washing clothes in the cellar, and as she did the wash, you heard her sing. There was a song that must have been her favorite, as she always seemed to sing this one tune. One day, Helen got a Sune tape, and she was so elated to hear Sune singing Vranice, and she finally learned the title of her mother's favorite song. Stana's growing up was not detailed to her children as Luka detailed his life and many times when they would gather together in the evenings, and he would reminisce about his days growing up in the old country. But Stana did tell some little incidents that brought some laughter to us. She told how her and Vaja were inseparable growing up. One day they got a little mischievous. They climbed an apple tree and hid in the branches. If anyone passed by, they would pelt the person with an apple. One day, an old man was walking by, and they pelted him. To their shock, the man saw them and called them harlots and some other crude, unkind words. And as he left, they got down from the tree, and there was no more pelting anyone with any more apples. Growing up in the Silo was not an easy life for any peasant growing up. Peasant life is exactly that, peasant life. Kata and Janko's income was dependent upon their abilities to raise some kind of livestock. And when they had enough livestock that they were able to sell, besides feeding themselves, they would do so. Sons and daughters in the Silo were called to help with the cutting of wheat, hay, shucking corn, feeding the livestock, taking cows to pasture, and so it was even with Stana and her sisters. Usually families were very poor and could not afford to keep much stock or even to hire. Some of the families couldn't even hire people to come and do their work. The house that Stana grew up in was far from being a house. That is, a house that's we think of as a house. Their house was, one side was for the livestock, and the other half was living quarters for the family. I doubt if any of us would want to be living in such squalor. But those were times that peasants that came over here tried to escape from such living and wanted to make something better of their lives than what they had over there. Stana's mother, Kata, was very good at baking bread. Luka once told the story of how he came to their home, and Kata had just baked several loaves of bread. His mouth just watered to have a bite, and he thought, oh, maybe she would offer him a piece. But she never did, and he never forgot it, and he would always remind Stana how her mother didn't want to give him a bite of bread. But Stana told him they were hungry for a bite of bread too, but that bread was made to be sold so that the family had some money to pay for their other bare necessities. Luka said Janko was a good trader in Serbian, a Trgovac. Once he took a male pig that was rolling around in mud, and he took the mud and put it over the pig's private parts, and he took it to market, and Luka said he sold it as a sow, so he would always tease Stana that her father was pretty good at fooling the people at market, and he would classify him as the good Trgovci. Indeed, growing up in a cellar was not an easy life for a peasant. Most of the peasants were as bad off as their neighbors. Luka always would tell us there was no welfare, and people here, there was no welfare like people had here in America, as far as being poor and hungry as he and others were. There were no doctors and clinics to treat one's illness, as the so-called poor here in America have. Your neighbor back then, if he was a little better off than you, would hire you to help cut his wheat, hay, or whatever, and you considered yourself lucky if you were able to bring home a few pennies that might be enough to buy some seeds or a little bit of flour of some sort to make cornmeal mush or anything that could sustain the family for that meager amount. Luka laughed when he heard his children ask what were the homes like back then. He told them one side of the home was the family's living area, and a cow or two shared the other half. He said the housewife could be cooking, and nearby the cow could be seen and heard urinating. When he told this, of course, his children had a disgusting look upon their face, and seeing their look, he would say, "Children, there was no wooden floor in the home, and there was no furniture. They had a wooden table and some benches to sit down on when they ate. As for how they slept, he said they slept on straw beds. Above the kitchen was an attic area in which meat was hung and smoked from the fire burning in the kitchen." He told the story of the tax official who one day came to their home, and his brother happened to be at home that day and above where the meat was hanging. If people didn't have money on hand to pay the due tax, the tax collector would climb up and take a ham or something. When the tax collector started to climb up to the loft and saw Luka's brother, Dragic was not willing to give up their meager bit of meat to the man, and holding the club in his hand, he calmly said to the man, "Come on up." The man, of course, got off the ladder and came down and left. Stana told the time her mother told her she was at the age when she ought to be married, and one of the families in the village knew Kata had an eligible daughter, and they had a son. Daughters had no say-so back then when it came to marriage. One evening, the parents and their son came to Kata's home with the traditional apple and dowry. Stana took a peek at the prospective groom and didn't like what she saw. She said he wasn't very good looking and had a big nose on his face. She told her mother, no way will she marry that man, and she stood firm. Kata was so upset and kept telling Stana she has to marry him. And when they came, Kata accepted them and took the dowry they offered. All this proved to be quite outrageous to the family when they found out Stana didn't want to marry their son. And of course, they wanted the dowry back, and the dowry was already spent. Stana's oldest sister, Stanka's husband, Janko Selak, went to America. He wanted to bring Stanka over, but she refused to go. So they let Stana go in her place. Kata told Janko to find her a husband when she got to America. Since Stanka refused to come over, Stana took the opportunity and came in her place. She got on a train in Karlov